I don't already know, my name is Meredith Malone. I'm the Associate Curator at the Northern Land Kemper Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all here this evening and to introduce our distinguished speaker, Museum Director and Vice President, Global Art Programs at the Asia Society in New York, Melissa Chiu. Now, Dr. Chiu has worked at the Asia Society since 2001 to expand the scholarship of Asian art through major initiatives such as the launch of a contemporary art collection to complement the museum's Rockefeller collection of traditional Asian art. Before coming to the Asia Society, she was founding director of the Asia-Australia Arts Centre in Sydney, Australia. As a leading authority on Asian contemporary art, she's organized nearly 30 exhibitions of artists from across Asia, including China, Japan, Iran, Pacific Islands, and Korea. Highlights include the first retrospective of Chinese artist Zhang Guan in 2007, and the historical exhibition of art from China's Cultural Revolution titled Art in China's Revolution from 2008. Dr. Chiu earned an MA in Arts Administration and a PhD in Art History in her native Australia, and has served as editor for the Grove Dictionary of Arts section on Asian Contemporary Art, published by Oxford University Press. She is the author of numerous articles and books, including Breakout Chinese Art Outside China from 2007, a book which focuses on the international Chinese artistic diaspora, Chinese Contemporary Art, 7 Things You Should Know from 2008, Asian Art Now from 2010, and an anthology titled Contemporary Art in Asia, A Critical Reader from 2011. She is Vice President of the Association of Art Museum Directors, the lead professional organization of art museums in the United States. In her talk this evening, titled, you can see here, Chinese Contemporary Art, Women Artists, she will explore key female contemporary artists in China, identifying major themes in their work, including issues of gender and everyday life. Now, I also want to point out that this evening's event is presented in conjunction with the exhibition that's currently on view in the teaching gallery in our permanent collection on the 2nd floor of the Kemper Art Museum. The exhibition is titled Women Contemporary Chinese Art. This is a multimedia exhibition that explores how an emerging generation of female artists in China artistically mediate cultural and socio-political conditions of life in the rapidly globalized context of contemporary China. Woman is the inaugural exhibition of the Arthur Greenberg Curatorial Fellowship, a competitive program jointly sponsored by the Kemper Art Museum and the Department of Art History and Archaeology, offering undergraduate students in art history the opportunity to curate an exhibition in the museum's teaching gallery. Now, this fellowship program was made possible through the generosity of James Cohen and named in memory of Arthur Greenberg, both of whom are alumni of Washington University. I want to point out, I'm happy then to congratulate our student curators who are here tonight in the front row. We have Danielle Wu, Samantha Allen, and Elizabeth Court. And I'd also like to recognize Professor Christina Klukin for her role as advisor to the students. Lastly, I want to extend thanks to the Sam Fox School and the School of Arts and Sciences for their support in this inaugural exhibition of the Arthur Greenberg Curatorial Fellowship. And now I'd like to ask you in joining me, welcoming our speaker tonight, Melissa Chiu.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at the University in St. Louis and have the opportunity to talk to all of you about Chinese contemporary art, including women artists. So I think one of my original intentions for this lecture was to introduce the work of some artists who happen to be women from the Chinese contemporary art scene. But when I began to think about it further, I thought that it might be more helpful for us to be able to look at the actual development of Chinese contemporary art and see how some of those women artists actually fitted into the broader picture. So rather than focus specifically only on women artists, what I'm going to do is trace the development of Chinese contemporary art over the last 30 years and see how women artists actually played a role. So hence the Chinese contemporary art women artists. When we think of Chinese contemporary art, we really think of it as being born in 1979. 1979 was the year, of course, when Deng Xiaoping declared his open door policy, which really opened up China for the first time since the Cultural Revolution to both the ideas of foreign investment, and this really had an impact on the art scene, because coming out of the Cultural Revolution, which took place from 1966 to 1976, this was a time when China was really closed off and involved in its own politics. This was a period when Mao mobilized the youth of the country to upset the kind of traditional equilibrium, if you like. But I often like to think of the Cultural Revolution as part of a global youth movement, because if you think of 1968 and what was happening in other places like Paris, Brixton, or even Berkeley here in the United States, it was a time when a younger demographic, the youth, really, if you like, asserted itself. So, in any case, 1979, we have the very birth of the Chinese contemporary art scene, which is often cited as being this, with this exhibition, which was by a group of artists who called themselves the Stars, or the Xinxin group. And knowing that they couldn't necessarily show their work in the National Art Museum in Beijing, they did the next best thing, and they showed their work on a fence of a park just opposite the National Art Museum. So you see here, it was mostly paintings, some sculptures, and it attracted a great deal of people. In fact, it was recorded much later in Newsweek, primarily because the police who confiscated the work because the artist had not sought a license to have a public exhibition. And the artists later mounted a protest under the banners of "We want democracy and we want freedom." And so you see from the very beginning of the establishment of the avant-garde in China, it was intrinsically linked to a sense of politic. I've chosen Wang Keping, who was one of the artists in this Stars group. And this sculpture, which was done just the year before the actual exhibition, but I think it summarizes in many ways the feelings of this period, which was that they were coming out of basically a Maoist period, and we know the reference to Mao through the five-pointed star on the figure's hat. But we see very clearly that he has one eye half closed and one eye open. And when we think of how Deng Xiaoping was coming to terms with the Maoist legacy, Mao died in 1976, it was understood that some of Mao's policies were good for China, but many of them were not good. And so Deng Xiaoping, in his pragmatic fashion, was used to saying that Mao's policies were 60% bad, 60% good and 40% bad. And so when we think of this one eye open and one eye half closed, this was a kind of recognition of this, this kind of uneasy legacy. Just out of interest, there was one woman artist in the 12-member foundation group for the Stars, and her name was Li Shuang. She mostly did paintings, and she was one of the artists who, in the subsequent decade in the 1980s, left China for Paris and then London. And this decade, although we often think of it as the formation decade, when the 85 New Wave movement and other things happened, which I'm going to talk about later, it was also known as being gripped by leave the country fever. And what that really meant was that if you had an opportunity to leave the country, you really did. We forget today, of course, because so many Chinese artists stay in China or have gone back. But at this time, if you were an ambitious artist, you really felt as if there was no future for you in China, that you had to pursue opportunities overseas. And so that's what Li Shuang and many others, even Wang Keping today, is living in Paris. Now we head into the 1980s. This was a period of great optimism for this younger generation of artists. They were just entering art schools to be trained. In fact, the art schools had been closed during the Cultural Revolution. So they were able to now enroll themselves in art schools. And what took place was this kind of frenetic experimentation, because for the first time these artists were given access to books of Western art, historical books of Chinese art. And so what many of them did, like this artist Wang Guangyi, is that they kind of consumed images of Western art and tried to make sense of it for a Chinese context. So you have here an example. I've just put up a comparative image of Jacques-Louis David's piece that is off an obvious reference point for Wang Guangyi here. He's done a whole series of works in the late 80s that were called the post-classical series. And so what he was really doing was making sense of different subjects and compositions. And so some of those were biblical subjects, others were references to European paintings. You'll see 1 year later that Wang Guangyi's reference point is actually one that refers back to the Cultural Revolution. So you'll see that all of these artists during the 1980s were kind of this consuming images at a frantic kind of pace. They were trying to make sense of a sudden kind of opening up for them of the world. And here we have Wang Guangyi making reference to the time when he was a young artist being trained during the Cultural Revolution. For any of you who have studied drawing or painting, you'd know that one of the ways of really faithfully rendering or copying an image is to divide up the picture plane into a grid. And so that's how artists were taught to render official portraits of Mao. In fact, there were many copybooks that were distributed across China for artists to be able to do this, because to make an error or mistake in a portrait of Mao, you could suffer great consequences. You know, during the Cultural Revolution, the stories were told in the early days of the Cultural Revolution of the Mao. Some of the early Mao badges were actually made of porcelain, and some people, if their porcelain badges of Mao got broken somehow, were really heavily persecuted. So everyone knew how careful you had to be about images of Mao. And so Wang Guangyi here is, in a way, talking about that, talking about the reproduction of Mao portraits. But here the grid that he's drawn up is one that essentially feels like it's imprisoning Mao, rather than just simply being a grid. The 85 New Wave movement was one that, as I described, was really characterized by experimentation and trying to address a sense of world art history. And this is an example of one of the performance acts, because it wasn't just painting. Sometimes it was artists gathering together under a manifesto, like this one, Shaman Dada, where one of the leaders of that group, interestingly enough, was Wang Yongping. And after an exhibition of their paintings, they piled up the paintings in the courtyard of the place where they were showing, and then burned them and issued a manifesto that was all about the regenerative qualities of fire. And so you see they take their cues here from Dada, European Dada group. This decade really came to an end in '89 with the China Avant-Garde exhibition. At this point in time, there were very few women who were really part of the 85 New Wave. Probably a handful of women. I'm going to talk about one who made an indelible mark on this exhibition. This is considered the culmination of the 1980s and all of the developments that had happened. In fact, what was interesting about this show was that it happened at the National Art Museum in Beijing in February, so some months before the June 4th 89 events. Now, what had happened during this decade was that we often assume today that the state apparatus, if you like, or the state institutions were unsupportive of this movement. It's really not the case at all. In fact, the art universities and art schools even supported the construction of the goddess of democracy that was at Tiananmen. So you had here a number of major experimental art figures who were in universities teaching, really helping a whole new generation of artists think about avant-garde art. The image that you see here is of the outside steps of the National Art Museum in Beijing. So we started with 79, where the artists were outside and hanging their work in the fence of the park, and we closed this decade with artists finally at the National Art Museum. It was a huge show, and it really captured the zeitgeist of that generation because it showed paintings, installations, performances. And you'll note here that they created this logo of no U-turn, and this was their idea of never wanting to go backwards, only forwards. I mentioned the Shaman Dada and Wang Yongping. This is an example of a work from '87 that he did, and this kind of issue of coming to terms with two histories, essentially, Chinese art history and Western art history. So what did he do? He washed the two major books that outline these histories in a washing machine for 2 minutes, and what you see is the pulp of these two books. I've selected just these two images by way of showing the way that also so many of the works that were created during this period do not survive. We have to remember that there was absolutely no market for these works. There were also many of the artists lived in small apartments in Beijing and didn't have any storage nor studio, and so many of the works for this show, for example, were created and then destroyed. So the work that you see on the right-hand side, which is actually now part of the Walker Art Center's collection, so it's fabulous. It's here in the United States. It's really one of the important works from this period. But it does show you how works evolve in their lifespan. So Wang Yongping would have recreated this for another showing. Shubing, this is one of the significant works from this period as well. It's called Tian Shu, or Heavenly Book. And it really is about the importance of writing, language and text in Chinese culture. So what you have is a series of woodblock prints in book form, kind of scripture form, in book form here, in scripture form, and then in poster form. And each of these formats, if you like, refer in different ways to the importance of language and text in Chinese culture. And so you see here, it was about a 4-year project where the artist carved each of these wood blocks, which are Chinese characters or words that are slightly incorrect. So to a Chinese reader, they would at first appear like you could read them, but you can't really. So there's a sense of frustration to that. Shalu, who at the opening of the China Avant-Garde exhibition shot her work called Dialogue. And it's considered a real, in some ways, a kind of premonition of the June 4th events. But it was certainly a moment that is important to the telling of Chinese contemporary art history, because her and her then boyfriend Tang Sung were arrested, detained for a few days, but released because both of them had high-level connections. Their parents were in the government and they were released. But this kind of short or kind of stop-start to the exhibition is often seen again as a kind of a little bit of an idea of what was to come, both following the June 4th movement. Shalu moved very soon after this to Australia and lived there for nearly a decade and continued to actually started to collaborate with her boyfriend Tang Song when they lived there, and now she has returned to Beijing, where she has done a series of works that actually are silk screenshots about this very work. This is considered a kind of a watershed moment in Chinese contemporary art history because of her shooting the work and then actually kind of heralding a whole decade of issues around censorship for Chinese contemporary art. So what happened after June 4th? For the art world, it was, there were significant consequences. For many of those who were teaching in the art academies, it meant that they were either, especially those who did experimental type work, many of them lost their jobs or were told they couldn't continue. Some of them who were already overseas decided to stay and requested refugee status. There were a number of curators and artists in Paris at the time, including Wang Yongping, who sought that status. And for those who remained, it was a very difficult period. And for want of a better description, the Chinese contemporary art world basically went underground. And for most of the artists that we'll now focus on for this decade, they were mostly kind of called unofficial artists because they weren't able to show their work. There were no, well, first of all, there were no galleries to speak of, right? There's no commercial art gallery scene. But before they could at least think about showing at the National Gallery, now this was completely out of limits. And so what happened was that a group of artists who were mostly painters sought opportunities overseas to show their work with some success. And then those artists who did more installation art showed their work in their apartments and studios. So contemporary art basically became a private experience. This artist that you see here, Wang Jinsong, I put it in just as a marker to show one of the few images, one of the few works that are really about June 4th. You know, most artists didn't do any work about what happened at Tiananmen. And so here we have Wang Jinsong. He says he's titled this painting "Taking a Picture in Front of Tiananmen" in 1990. So it's a year after the events, and it's very clearly based on this 1964 painting of peasants who have come to the capital. Now, what's the one thing that everyone wants to do if they've come from the provinces and they come to Beijing is have their picture taken at Tiananmen? Wang Jinsong clearly references this painting, yet we have a number of markers here that signal that it's obviously an update from the way that the people are dressed. This is a definite signal that these are part of the new burgeoning middle class. They are dressed in Western dress. Even in 1990, most people were not dressed like this. they were dressed in the Sun Yat-sen or Mao suits that you see here. It was pretty much a uniform. So he's signaling this new group of wealthy elite, but the absence of figures here in the background, these white ghosts, if you like, are a definite remark on those people who simply disappeared, Tiananmen. The fact that there was no publishing of their names. Many people just simply didn't go home that evening. So here we have one reference to what actually happened. I spoke before of the painters. So a kind of one group of artists who were mostly working in the summer palace on the outskirts of the city started to paint in ways that were coming to terms with the increase of multinational companies in China. This was a time when business was being done. And Wang Guangyi, whose earlier images I showed you, now does this great criticism series, which is about this bringing together of consumerism with the legacy of a communist ideology. And so he adapts a Cultural Revolution poster to incorporate the logos of various multinationals who were setting up shop in China. This is of the Tang, that kind of strange cordial drink that was very popular in China at the time, especially when you watched Chinese opera. It was something that was served at interval, but here's one example. Zhang Shaogang is another. These were known as the cynical realist painters and the political pop artists, and they started to gain a degree of notoriety, meaning they started to get international opportunities to show their work. In 1993, the first big international museum exhibition started to happen, one in Hong Kong and one in Berlin. So 1993 was a real marker point for museum appreciation of what was going on. So you might well be asking yourselves, where are the women in all of this? In these big shows that were all about the Chinese avant-garde, there were very few women. In fact, if I think of the Berlin show, there was maybe 2 women, if that. In our own Inside Out New Chinese Art exhibition at the Asian Society much later in 1998, there was less than a handful of women from mainland China. So within this period, there were very few women actually practicing, and even fewer who were able to get the kind of international opportunities to see their work. So partly, we see more women incorporated later in the 1990s, and I'm going to show you some of those examples. For those women who were practicing during this time, a lot of them have not continued. So that's one other, I think, challenge to telling of this kind of history. Zhang Shaogang is best known for this type of work. It's called Bloodlines. And like Wang Guangyi here, he is harkening back to the Cultural Revolution, because for this generation of artists, it was the formative period, their formative period. So each of these family members are linked by a faint red line. You see it. And that bloodline you can relate to having multiple meanings or dual meanings. On the one hand, it relates to this idea of filial piety, which was a traditional Confucian idea that you must pay respect to your elders and to your ancestors, which the Cultural Revolution completely destroyed actually. That in fact the youths, these children, were often called upon to denounce their parents or teachers, their elders. And so this bloodline is about that, on the one hand, the tradition of filial piety, the bloodline, in its most exact definition. But it also signals the change that happened in Chinese society when children were actually called, or youths were called upon to swear their allegiance away from their parents and elders and towards Mao and the state. Zai Jin, who is best known for her Banana Flower series, began this in the early 1990s. And you know what I would say about many of the Chinese artists who are women, just as the exhibition at the museum states, there is a resistance to being called a feminist artist. In fact, feminism as a kind of term is one that is fairly unfamiliar to Chinese women. They did not have a feminist movement per se, as we did here in the United States. When Mao came to power in 1949 and established the People's Republic, you know, he was well known for saying that women hold half the sky. Of course they hold half the sky, because in some ways women were given the opportunity to work in the same way as men. So it was more of a workplace employment issue that we have yet to see the same number of women represented in politics, in education and many other spheres. So when we talk about women artists, I think that in China there is always a little bit of a tension, because many of them don't identify at all with feminism. And one of the quirky things about the Chinese art world is that most of the women artists who have continued to practice are the wives of very well-known artists themselves. So they operate as a couple. Not necessarily showing their works, but it is interesting to see the way that one of the few ways that they've been able to continue is because they have the support of their husband to be able to continue to practice. So Zai Jin's wonderful, sometimes even relief paintings. She's continued this series called the Banana Flower series since the 1990s and continues, in fact. And they've always had an element of fleshiness to them, sometimes with relief and other kinds of materials applied to the canvas. And she resists any kind of formal or bodily connection to them. But she is one of those few women who were actually engaged in painting during this period. I chose this image. It's actually kind of interesting because on the flip side of the political pop and cynical realist painters was another younger group of artists who were situated in the East Village. Interestingly enough, they were inspired by Ai Weiwei's return from living in New York in the Lower East Side and the East Village to Beijing. He came back with many ideas about New York's East Village. And this younger group of artists, mostly made up of Ma Yuming, who you see pictured here, and Zhang Huang, who started to do quite, for the Chinese context, radical performances which were about endurance. They were mostly naked. Bearing in mind, this is the period when coming out of the Tiananmen crackdown, when performance was really not allowed, and certainly not nude performance. So Ma Yuming was arrested, Zhang Huang was pursued by the police. This was a very difficult situation. Now, one of the artists who sought to capture this East Village was Shindong, who you see pictured here, photographing Rong Rong. She's photographing Ma Yuming, the performance artist. This is a photograph by the photographer Rong Rong. So I'm just, one of the complications around this period especially in the East Village, was that these artists were doing performances, and it was very much an artist village environment with absolutely no concept of a market. And so Shindong, Rong Rong, and many other photographers were around taking photographs. And so as the market has developed for these art performance artist works, there have been some disputes and challenges around the authorship. I've shown you this by way of saying that Shindong was actually there at the East Village and recording performances. But she also, in her own right, is a photographer, and this is one of her works, which I think is a great and very unusual image for this period. Very few people were doing photography in China in 1995. Interestingly enough, it's the same year that the International Women's UN Convention was in Beijing, which is when Tian Miao launched her career, and I'm going to show you the first image of that. But this whole idea of the legacy of Mao and being born either, she wasn't actually born during the Cultural Revolution, but she was born with the Cultural Revolution legacy. You see Mao's portrait still there, still in the background, the flag, all of these kind of issues that become a heavy weight on the way that you think about the world, the way you think about image making. I think this is a very apt image for her to be describing the way her generation thinks. So this is one of the performances done just quite close to the East Village, but is it kind of considered a classic today because it is Zhang Huan's conceptual premise of to add 1 meter to an unknown mountain, which is clearly adding a meter through these artists' own bodies. And then again to raise the water level in a fish pond by invoking this group of itinerant workers who were living amidst the artists on the outskirts of the city. And here the other section is pictured with the owner of the fish pond's son. Ma Liming, I showed you an image of Shindong taking a photograph of Ma Liming's performance. I've included him because he plays with gender in an unusual way. Here is an artist who at this time looked very effeminate. In fact, he complained that people were often assuming that he was a woman. So he played with that in his performance by having his face made up and hair done as a woman, but then he would be naked. And so he played with this kind of gender issue of having a male body and what resembled a female face, which was very in China at that time, very radical. I mentioned 1995 as being this important date. There was a women's art exhibition held concurrently with the UN major conference. This was a conference when Hillary Clinton came and spoke, but it turned out to be something of a public relations disaster for the Chinese government. I think they thought it would be a group of women embroidering and knitting, not fully realizing that it was possibly the most radical group of women in the world descending upon them. So there was a whole, the conference itself was kind of disbanded because the Chinese didn't want certain meetings to happen. But one of the outcomes of it was an important exhibition organized by Liao Wen, who was a curator and writer. And a group of women artists were selected by her, including Lin Tian Miao, and this really launched Lin Tian Miao's career. Prior to this, she had spent nearly a decade living in New York, but not actually making work. Her husband, Wang Gongxin, was creating work as a video artist. They lived in Brooklyn. And she really supported the family by going to work as a designer, mostly of textiles. And when she returned to Beijing, she said that she was inspired by this idea or memory of helping her mother sew the family's clothes. And so what you see here are about 20,000 balls that have been of thread, of unbleached cotton thread that have been wound into balls and then splayed out from the mattress. In this, there are about 20,000 long needles that were otherwise used to sew kind of Hessian bags and sacks of wheat and things like that. And then in the pillar you have a monitor that shows this process of thread winding that she talks about. And the inclusion here is a long or elongated pair of trousers made from paper. And she talks about this installation as being very gendered, that the bed is very female and the trousers are very male. She's clearly working through kind of symbolic vocabulary, but it really is this thread winding that becomes very much her trademark. Yu Hong is an artist who has become important in terms of this new realist painting phenomenon or trend that we see today in China, but she's always been a great painter. And you see here, I think these are self-portraits, but images of daily life in the 1990s that would not have been out of character in this period. So you see the markets in the background, she's shopping. These were really her recordings, if you like, of everyday life. Yin Shizhen also is one of the key figures from the 1990s who really began with sculptural installation practice. And I love this work because for some reason what we find with a lot of the women artists in China, it starts with self-portraiture. It starts with themselves and then branches out. So in this work, we see various different portraits of herself inserted into these shoes. These shoes were standard issue shoes. Every single woman in China owned a pair of these shoes. From the Cultural Revolution through to probably even the late 1980s, I was able to buy a pair in Chengdu of all places. And I have to say that they're the most comfortable things on earth because they're handmade cotton, basically sewn together. And whenever I would wear them in China, it was really interesting. Men would say, "Oh, I like those shoes," and it was because it brought back memories of their childhood when their mothers and sisters and everyone would wear these shoes. But the trouble is they get moldy. You cannot get them wet. So that's where I think leather shoes are much more versatile. But partly she's talking about women, society, but with herself, being these self-portraits. And from this evolved a whole series of installations that were as much about representing her daily life and where she lived. She, with her husband Shindong, who was a notable conceptual and video artist, they lived in a hutong, or a traditional alleyway kind of environment in Beijing, and they saw the destruction of these hutongs throughout the kind of towards the late 1990s, and so many of her installations actually had cement and pieces of houses like tiles and things like that they had collected from these demolition sites. One of her works is also on display in the museum, one of the just over the road, the Portable Cities, which is a really great. I think it was such a wonderful, innovative way of her coming to terms with her new, very international life. She and Shindong started to, when their careers really took off, they started to travel and do residencies in all these different places. And so their lives became rather itinerant. And so these portable cities are wonderful kind of portraits of the cities where they spent time, all in a suitcase. So when we talk about the demolition or the destruction of architectural heritage that went on in the late 1990s in Beijing, this is an artist who also, like Yin Shijun, captured this, but through photographs. And Jacques Dali spent time in Italy and was kind of inspired by this idea of graffiti. So he would find these half-demolished sites and then spray paint or partly chisel out this outline, partly a self-portrait, partly graffiti. But, you know, I find this image interesting because it shows you how close, how within the city centre this demolition was occurring, because this is the Forbidden City here. And we know it, you know, Beijing is designed on an axis where the Forbidden City, the palace, is right in the centre of the city. And so we know this also because the Forbidden City is the only building that was allowed to have yellow tiles. That was a kind of royal insignia. So the 1990s, if you could characterize it as a decade, it was when Chinese contemporary art went international. It was when the first exhibitions of Chinese contemporary art happened. Chinese artists were at the 1993 Venice Biennale. They were in shows in Hong Kong, Berlin, and Sydney almost simultaneously that year. And from that decade on, Chinese artists were being taken up, mostly painters or installation artists, but they were being taken up in a way that we hadn't ever seen before. And so we come to the end of the decade, and the Chinese government finally relaxes its former policies from '89. And we see Chinese contemporary artists for the first time able to show their work in museums, and it all kind of started with the Shanghai Biennale in 2000, 2001. And that was the first time that foreign artists and installation art and other previously thought of as problematic forms of art were allowed into the museums. And I chose this image by Wang Qing-song, who is, I think, one of the notable artists of this generation who's working in photography, because he summarized in many ways the last 3 decades of a Chinese experience. So here we have the past, present, and future. This image representing the past. The artist here is shown as a wounded soldier paying tribute. And we see here the soldiers are covered in mud or clay. It's a rather static representation, but one that looks very similar to a socialist realist sculpture in bronze that you might see even today at Tiananmen. So it's very much about the past and the legacy and the idea of the soldiers being heroic members of Chinese society. Here, the present. China as a manufacturing hub. Most of what we own today is made in China. These, the figures who were once soldiers have now been replaced by factory workers. They're covered in a semi-precious metal, silver. And the artist himself is shown in what is an urbane kind of middle-class dress. The baseball cap is one signal of that. And of course he owns a dog. You needed a dog. You needed quite an expensive license to have a dog, so he's clearly of this newly emergent middle class. Finally, the image of the future. We see it as rendered in a precious metal of gold, but it's much more of a static image. There's no movement forward, there's no positioning. It looks, in fact, a little like a diadem or crown. The artist is shown here with pot lids as symbols, and on a bicycle, surrounded by symbols of abundance and celebration, from the lanterns to the foodstuffs and things like that. So for him, the prediction of China's future is a rather prosperous one. Younger artists after 2000 also started to look back to history, and this is one video artist. So artists also started to work in photography and video in greater numbers, and Yang Fudong adopted what was a very traditional theme throughout centuries of Chinese painting and decorative arts, which was the 7 intellectuals in a bamboo forest or grove. And so it was this idea of the 7 intellectuals retreating from society and reveling with drink and poetry and things like that. So it's a very traditional notion which he updated for the Shanghai youth, and there are these series of fine videos which are about the travels or journeys of these youth. What started to happen also after 2000 is a growing understanding of white-collar or office kind of environment. And so here Xu Jinsung has speculated on the office as a trap or as a weapon. So if you look at the seat and the chair, each of these are points like knives, the manacles, or even the guillotine for the monitor. Selfie is, I think, an important artist of her generation because she's dealing with all of these, probably in a more humorous way. This is a series of photographs and video works, and the video is fabulous because it shows these people dressed as puppy dogs behaving like bad puppy dogs in the workplace, and they're all dressed in Burberry designs. And she was an artist who began her career in the south of China, in Guangzhou, which is where most of the manufacturing, it was one of the first places that was declared a special economic zone. So that's where all the factories first started. And so she was a witness to the development of prosperity in that area of China. And so she saw these young kind of yuppies start their life in an office. And if you ever get to see the video, it's kind of hilarious because it's to a disco beat, and these puppy dogs are misbehaving and pooping and doing all sorts of bad things in the office. So I spoke before about Yang Fudong and the return to tradition. This is one artist who's doing it in terms of photography and using his own body, where he painted a traditional Shanshui landscape over his body with a series of different arm gestures. And I think if anything it suggests, of course, the importance of tradition to an understanding of China, but also the fragility of it. And we see more and more this idea of Chinese people trying to recapture their traditions that were possibly lost during the Cultural Revolution. Yu Hong, with more recent paintings here, you'll see that there's been an abstraction of the painting plane for her, that she's continuing to do self-portraits and use models in those self-portraits. But, and in fact you'll see the reference to the kind of making of art here. She's actually applying plaster to her model on both accounts. And, you know, I think what is evolving in her work is a much stronger sense of herself, that it's less her and her environment, but just simply about her and her painting practice that I think is really of interest. She's experimenting more and more with the idea of the picture plane. So her recent exhibition at the Shanghai Art Museum showed very different perspectives, from an aerial perspective or a lower perspective. So it's more for her an experimentation around painting and composition right now. And Selfie, who continues to do work in new media. So she started in photography and video, and now has, as early as 2007, created a city in Second Life. And so she has sold real estate to collectors in Second Life, and think she's one of the first artists to do so. Second Life, of course, by now, technology evolves so quickly, is less, it's less of a proposition. It's kind of had its day. However, the fact that she was interested in occupying and creating something for an alternative sphere, I think, is of interest. And she's playing with the tropes of what China could be. So we have here a number of references, whether it's to the National Olympic Stadium, otherwise known as the Bird's Nest, that Ai Weiwei and Herzog de Meuron designed. You have the Pearl Tower from Shanghai, and this kind of floating panda. I mean, in many ways it's a kind of naughty reference to all the assumptions, if you like, about the architecture and environment of China. It's called Renminbi City, which is the Chinese currency. Other works that she's done, for some reason we couldn't download it just here, but she's also developed a character that occupies Second Life called China Tracy, which is her alter ego. And I think that this interest in developing a kind of second world, if you like, is one that I think will have greater resonance as we go forward. We're all entering into a period of adjusted reality, if you've seen any of the Google goggles and things like that. So, I think that she's going to be one of those important artists in terms of developing how art can be related to new technologies. So in conclusion, what I really wanted to get across this evening was that Chinese women artists do resist ideas of that they are necessarily feminists. There are few of them. Some of the challenges I think today for them, because there is no lack of women artists in the art colleges. There are many female students. I think the real challenge for them is beyond art school, getting the professional opportunities and support network to show their work. And then, of course, if you look at the support for the market of their work, because there are very few women artists who are at the same level as their male counterparts. So things are better than they ever have been for women artists, but there are still substantial challenges that I think will only be overcome with time and more role models for younger women artists. So thank you very much.
Questions, so open it up to the audience. So, with Xiaolu firing the shot into her own installation in 1989, given the events of June 4th, that action has often been interpreted as political. But with her 2010 biography, she denies it's expressly political and that it's much more about personal relationships. How do you think that has recast our opinions of the politics of Xiaolu dialogue since then?
Yeah, what I think is kind of also interesting about the Xiaolu example is that there's been a whole effort to rehistoricize that work. And I say that because in the early writings on that event, it was always Xiaolu and Tang Song. The photograph of them being arrested was actually of Tang Song being arrested, and that was the one that was distributed in all of the books and magazines and everything like that. So I think when Xiaolu went back to China, there was a huge campaign to recast that work as her work and not as the arrest, which emphasized Tang Song, because on a personal level they had broken up, right? So they were no longer together as a couple. So I think that probably looking back on it, it was not a political act. I think it was her kind of artistic thinking of an idea of destruction because there was, there was a very healthy debate during the 80s, and we often think of the 80s as being a much more healthy, critical environment than today. Lots of art magazines, lots of writers, lots of people wanting to talk about art. So my interpretation of it was very much about that work. And then the whole arrest thing kind of overshadowed it. And so when I kept on saying we think of it as a premonition, I think that it was actually the closure of the show, the kind of clampdown, that is more a premonition to the later censorship than her shooting the work. So I think it's all been intertwined now, and it's kind of complicated because of the personal relationships. Yeah. Thank you very much.